we'll go ahead and get started this evening. Thank you everyone for joining us for our Poultry Management webinar provided by Marcy Ward.
I want to thank the group once again for their invitation to have me come speak to you tonight. Shifting gears a little bit away from sheep, goats, and cattle, we're moving into poultry. And I'm going to present sort of a 10,000 foot view, if you will, of poultry management, some things to consider from anywhere from how many chickens does it take to how do you keep them healthy and safe. I'm going to talk a little bit about the avian flu, simply because that is prevalent in the US at the moment. So I'll give you a quick update on that and maybe how to help prevent that in your own flock. So one of the things that's happened in the last, I don't know, 10 years or so is a big increase in interest in backyard flocks, particularly in urban suburban areas. And so with that comes a lot of questions. How many is too many, or what do I need in terms of how many chickens? And they do multiply, right? Particularly if you have a rooster. And so if you have some general knowledge of production, then you can kind of figure out how many chickens you need. So with a good, productive, healthy bird in her peak production, she will yield around 250 eggs a year. As chickens age, they get, an old chicken is about 6 or 7 years old. That's getting up there. They're at 30% of their maximum capacity. So their ability to produce quality eggs and consistent production goes way down. So the rule of thumb, though, is not only kind of gauge how much your family will eat, how much you're going to give away, that kind of thing. But 3 laying hens per household member is usually a fairly good number, given the fact you're not going to get an egg from every chicken every day. So that sort of evens that out. But do remember, particularly if you've got roosters, it does require a rooster to hatch chicks. That a hen can raise 10 to 14 chicks in a clutch. That's the batch of eggs that she'll set on. And so that immediately multiplies your flock substantially. Granted, you'll might have some death loss there, but still 1 bird times 10 or 14 really adds up very quickly. And these are very quick growing animals. They mature in about 20 weeks. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And be prepared. A lot of people, they get this idea of want backyard chickens, and that'd be great, without the concept of harvesting these birds for food, meat protein. But if that is an option, then that kind of gives you a little more room to have a few more birds. So just a little bit of chicken 101. Pullets are your young females, and their age technically is 6 to 20 weeks. And you can expect to start seeing eggs out of those young females at about 20 to 24 weeks. Now, I say use caution here, is if you're going to go out and search for birds that are closer to hatching or to laying eggs, because of what we're dealing with right now with avian flu, I'd be a little bit leery at this right now. Not to say that you can never do this, but I'd be a little leery of buying older birds from business, unless you really are confident that they haven't been in contact or at risk of the disease. So chicks are readily available at your farm stores, your neighbors, all that. When you get them through, or even through the mail. Now, typically they should come sexed, but sometimes that's not the case. It's helpful if they are, so you know what you're getting. Are they healthy? So when you're at, say, Tractor Supply, for example, and there's a pen full of chicks, and you can kind of hopefully gauge, look at their eyes, look at their, their nostrils, or they, do they just look weak? These are some indications those might not be healthy birds. And even if you buy healthy birds, just anticipate, you know, they're at a very vulnerable age right now, and you could experience some death loss. So there's over 50 breeds to choose from, at least accessible in the United States. There's far more beyond that, beyond our borders. So you can get very creative in building your flock and have a wide variety. It takes a little more research to find some of the more exotic breeds. But then you also want to decide kind of what is your goal. You know, are you going to raise them for meat, or is it predominantly just egg production? Fortunately, with chickens, it's really a matter of both, right? So you do have the ability to raise them for meat and eggs. But there's certain breeds that are less broody, rapid growing, like the Plymouth Rock and the Cornish Cross. Those are the birds that will grow quite quickly for you to fill your freezer. And then egg production, you're going to find a little more moderate sized birds that are broody, typically the Cochins, I can't pronounce that one, Buff Orpingtons and light Brahmins. You also have your Bantams, the little guys, can produce nice colored eggs. The ones that are probably the most common in my mind, the Plymouth Rock or Barred Rock as I know them, Rhode Island Reds, and then the Sussex are kind of a nice for both products. So when you're thinking about your facilities, square footage is important. Make sure you're not over cramming or crowding these birds. So they do require 2.5 to 3 square foot per bird, per mature bird. And then for roost space, anywhere from 6 to 8 inches should be sufficient. They do tend to like to crowd sometimes, so that should be enough. It's really important that you provide protection in terms of screening, even over the roof of the pen, because sometimes those predators come from the sky rather than, you know, raiding the chicken house, so to speak. So that will help as well reduce predation. Make sure the feed and water should be easily accessible to be cleaned and filled, because cleanliness on these guys is really important. If you've ever been to a high production poultry facility, you know, it's a kind of a shower in, shower out, disinfectant everywhere, because they're really wanting to protect the health of these birds. And the same, to a certain extent, should be considered for your own flock. In raising the young guys, you'll have what are called brooder houses, and it's simply a place that offers consistent warm source of heat. And lamps or heat plates can be used like what's pictured here. And then that they need to stay in there till at least 6 weeks of age. And then once they've kind of graduated from the brood size, keep in mind they're still pretty young. They're pretty vulnerable to getting picked on by the mature birds. So you'll want to make sure that they're well, healthy, on feed, can take care of themselves before you introduce them to the main flock. Plenty of feed and water space, meaning more holes than you have birds, ideally, like in your feeders. And that just allows that they have ample access to food and water at all times. These guys really need to have good access to water just to maintain health and their temperature. I'll kind of reiterate this at the end, but you want to make sure too that they clean the pens really regular, because they can carry a lot of disease from the manure. Sorry about the dogs. And then remove any sick birds immediately, because you don't know what you're dealing with. It could be contagious. Handle those birds with care yourself, because it could be transmissible to humans. So wear gloves. So going into the nutrition component of things, does anybody have any questions? I went through the first part fairly quickly. No? Okay. So they're really pretty simple in terms of their digestive tract, and unique at the same time. So they have this crop that's the first stop for food. And this is where the grit will fill the pocket of, small stones. They use that to break down the particle size of their food a little bit. And then it will move into this proventriculus. This is their stomach, effectively. Has the gastric juices to help with digestion. Then we all know that the gizzard is a very compact muscle that, again, is there because they don't have teeth, right? So they can't really chew their food to grind it into smaller pieces. And that's where the crop and the gizzard come into play to make sure it gets down into small enough size that it can be absorbed in the small intestine. Okay. So when I used to teach feeds and feeding at the college I was at before, this class of livestock was in some ways the easiest, but in some ways the most difficult and challenging to build a ration for. They're omnivores, which means they are able to eat meat and you'll see them picking on a mouse, or, they'll eat bugs and then they'll eat grass. And so they really have a wide variety of diet if they're out in the open. But at the same time, it's that pesky egg that you're trying to build that really makes it challenging to get enough mineral in their diet to make a good quality eggshell and protein. The other thing is the grit component, which is kind of easy. They will pick up pebbles off the ground to kind of take care of themselves in that regard. But because there's such a tricky balance between getting enough minerals to produce a quality egg and protein to grow the feathers, these guys are pretty susceptible to nutrition deficiencies, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So like I said before, water is absolutely key, that it's available at all times with these guys. They can become overheated very easily. However, they're kind of picky. They don't like water too cold. So in the winter months, you might want to keep where it's open at all times, or too warm. So keep it out of the direct sunlight in the heat of the summer, because either extremes in temperatures will throw off their water consumption, and we really don't want to throw it off in the summer months in particular. Mention the grit. Now calcium, like I said, this is the challenge for our layers to continue to build really nice eggs. They need a lot of calcium if you give their percent in their diet, it's quite high compared to any other animals that we try and build rations for. So they need 3+ grams of calcium alone a day. That's a lot of calcium for a small animal. If you want to put it in perspective, a mature cow that weighs 1,000 pounds requires about 17 grams when she's not milking. And so you can see that this is a pretty heavy lift for these birds to try and consume. And the best way to deliver that, in my opinion, in terms of being most digestible, most bioavailable, is oyster shell. However, it can be expensive and it can be hard to find at times. If you can't find oyster shell, you can certainly use limestone. That would work as well. But have that separate from your feed, so they'll supplement themselves with the oyster shell. So what happens if we don't get enough calcium in their system? This is a pretty common that you'll see in chicks. I call it spider leg or spraddle legs. Rickets effectively is what it could also be considered. But basically, this is an imbalance of calcium to phosphorus. That's what P stands for. And normal, which is excessively high compared to other livestock, is a 12 parts calcium to 1 part phosphorus in the diet. That's your goal. Here you can see it's 3.5 grams to 0.29 grams of phosphorus. That's what you got to have for a bird to be in optimum production and growth. And avoid that spider leg syndrome in your young birds. Okay. The other challenge is the protein, like I said. Now, it's not so much a protein deficiency per se, it's more of an amino acid. And amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. There's over 20 of them that are essential. And there's two in particular that cause birds a little bit of fit, and that's lysine and methionine. And the reason those two amino acids can be problematic in their diets is because their base diet of grain, like corn and oats, barley, even soybean meal, lacks lysine to adequately meet the needs of the bird. So if you think about, what feathers are made of, they're approximately 85% protein. So whenever they're eating protein, they're putting it towards muscle growth and feather development. So we really got to make sure they're getting adequate protein in their diet. They will tell you when nutrition isn't correct. You will see feather loss or really slow regrowth after a molt. You do want to make sure you're not dealing with more of a pecking issue. A lot of times that occurs if they're overcrowded. And you'll get one low man on the, that gets picked on a lot literally, and they'll pluck the feathers down on that bird. And so you just want to be careful that you're not dealing with that versus something more nutritional. Nutrition would be the next question, and then the third question would be disease, but it's more likely a pecking order situation than nutrition. So vitamin D goes hand in hand with calcium metabolism and use. And so it is one of the more common vitamin deficiency challenges, simply because the natural diet, just like with those amino acids, isn't really dense in vitamin D. Vitamin D, you're finding, like you say, in your milks, your cheeses, and some of those sources. And ironically, eggs are a good source of vitamin D, but their diet is naturally low. So it's nice to have a balanced ration to provide the added boost of the vitamin D in that mix. So I don't know if any of you have ever experienced this. It's kind of neat to see, even though it's not really a good thing, but I call them rubber eggs. This egg effectively has no solid shell. It's just really jiggly. And that's an indication of a deficiency, either in calcium or vitamin D or both. So the other deficiencies similar to the calcium imbalance is osteoporosis in the mature birds. They get crooked legged, and then poor egg production. And then you get the spider legs in those young chicks like you see here. Other vitamins of concern in a class of called fat soluble, there's a vitamin A, E, and K. Now, fortunately, those vitamins are readily found in most of what the chicken eats. So vitamin A and E are pretty good in your corn products. Vitamin K is usually fairly decent in your green forages. What happens though is where you run into trouble with those is they're sensitive to heat. So if your feed gets overheated, in the summer months, you're storing it in a hot barn, that degrades a lot of those valuable vitamins. And so you'll want to ramp up vitamin supplementation somehow, or keep your feed fairly fresh during that time. B1 and B2 are water-soluble vitamins. Pretty rare to have issues here, but they are tied to neurological health. And so if you start to see some neurological problems in your animals, I would lean more on these vitamin challenges, because a lot of vitamins are tied to neurological health. But again, B1 and 2 are pretty readily available in their diet. Unlike cattle and sheep can make their own sources of most B vitamins, where chickens cannot. But like I said, their diet should cover that. So what happens is again, because the calcium requirement is so high, it is challenging to get a poultry ration with high enough protein and energy. So you really need to find rations that are really nutrient dense if possible. If you're wanting to maximize growth for meat production, if you're wanting to maximize egg production, then that's where you might want to look at the prepared feeds. If you're looking for just, a few eggs a week and maybe an older bird eventually you'll butcher, or a young bird you decide to butcher, and rate of growth and number of eggs aren't a huge concern. They're one thing with chickens, in a lot of ways, they're fairly forgiving because they will eat everything, right? You can take your dinner scraps out and they make them pretty happy because they'll eat it all. But at the same time, you know, they are a little tricky on some of those deficiencies. So there's different types of products that you can buy. Most common are usually your starter products for the young chicks and the pullets. And you'll want to find them in either a meal or in a crumble. A lot of times that you want those smaller particles just so that they're able to digest them fairly readily. And you can see the starter feeds are very high in protein, 18 to 20%. Where as that bird matures, the protein requirement just steadily declines, but they still require a fair amount, about 16% protein to remain fairly productive. Now, pretty common, we called it cob when I worked for Purina, corn, oats, and barley, but chicken scratch, if you will, is just whole grains, rolled corn, oats, barley, maybe some Milo in there. And all of those products are less than 16% protein. So effectively, you would want to somehow supplement them with mealworms or something that's higher in protein to ensure that they're at least getting their nutritional requirements met. And it doesn't have to be super, balanced to the T, but you've got some options, I guess, is what I'm saying on those mature birds. Does anybody have any questions on the nutrition side of things? No? Okay. Well, we're going to move into health management, and I'm going to start off with vaccinations. I think this is something that we don't think too much about when we think about backyard birds, but just like any livestock, it's recommended that they stay current on certain more common diseases with vaccines. And you can get these vaccines either through your veterinarians or even online through like Valley Vet and that. So I'm going to first talk about this Marek's disease. It's called fowl paralysis. It causes neurological disease in animals. It's in poultry, fairly contagious. However, it's a little tricky. So you can't just go buy 6 doses of this product. So what oftentimes you can find, though, are vaccinated chicks already. So ask your supplier if they've already been vaccinated with Marek's, and then they should be good. But basically what this is this is 2,000 doses of product. This little bottle with the 200 mils 1,000 doses. So they'll mix a little bit of the diluent in with the virus pellet, and then they'll redistribute the dissolved virus pellet into the diluent, and then it's 0.2 mils on your vaccine. So if you have 1,000 birds to vaccinate, then it might work. But really, it would be best if you make sure that they've at least been covered by the disease from the people you buy your birds from. Something that you can control, and even this little bottle has about 10,000 doses, but it's not very expensive. But it's Newcastle and bronchitis combined. And both of these diseases are fairly infectious and both attack the respiratory system. Again, you might visit with your veterinarian if there's cases of Newcastles that have cropped up. I know last year, I think California dealt with this disease, not as common in our more sparse population areas, rural areas, but bronchitis certainly is something that will creep up on you in a flock, and it will go through your entire flock if you're not careful. So this would be just some cheap insurance on your vaccines to get them covered that way. Fowl pox is probably least common of all of these Again, it'd be a case-by-case basis to vaccinate for this particular disease, but it's similar to our pox diseases. It will create skin and internal organ lesions. So how to give a shot to a chicken. So it should be subcutaneous or under the skin. For chicks, I would recommend that you go in the nape of the neck and pinch like this demonstration shows here. And then for mature birds, you can do it at the wing, again, under the skin, or the nape is acceptable. The reason I don't think the nape or the wing would work very well on the young birds is you could have a risk of injuring the birds just because of their age. Now, one thing in this picture I don't like is he's getting ready to swab the area with alcohol, which from our standpoint, when we go to get a shot, sometimes we get swabbed with alcohol, but keep in mind that the alcohol can ultimately damage the vaccine. So if you feel like you want to clean the area, go ahead, but make sure that alcohol is fully evaporated off before you inject the bird, because you want to make sure he's getting a fully effective vaccine. And that's true with any livestock animal. You're going to use very light, very short needles, light gauge meaning 20 to 22 gauge, because these guys don't have very thick skin, particularly the chicks. So you don't need a lot of needle to get the job done. And then most of these vaccines require a very small dose. So you're going to get, when you buy the syringes, like those 2 mils or even less, I think there's 1 mil vaccine syringes that you can buy because you only need 0.2 for a dose. Parasite control is pretty important as well. This is where you can also lose feathers to lice infestation and mites. So having a regular dusting protocol to keep those boogers away is really important. And there's several products out there you can get permethrins. If you're not really comfortable with that and you want to go all natural, you can certainly try some of those organic products that are available as well. Permethrin can also be used as a premise spray, so it can help control not only the animals' parasites, but keep them kind of at bay around the perimeter of your coop. Internal parasites can be problematic, and most of the wormers are in the oral form, and there's various ways you can do this. You can find little crumbles that you can feed, or you can put it in the water. It just depends on the product itself. You can again find all natural. As far as effectiveness of those garlic blended anthelmetics, I don't have a lot of data to tell you about on those. It would be more of a personal preference and see how it goes. But there's several products on the market that can do that. I would do that maybe once a year, maybe twice. We live in pretty arid country where internal parasites shouldn't be a problem, but if they're in confinement quite a little and the pens aren't really cleaned as well as maybe they should be, having a good parasite control program is probably a good idea. In addition to the parasites, you do want to control your flies and mosquitoes the best you can as well, simply because these guys are vectors for multiple diseases. Whenever they transfer, if they're blood feeders and they bite one animal that's sick and then they go bite your animal that's healthy, then they're likely transferring a disease of whatever the previous animal had. So that's why we call them vectors. Flies, ticks, mosquitoes, all of these guys have the capabilities of spreading disease. So you want to do your best to try and minimize that threat. For the mosquito side of it, keeping your waters fresh will prevent those mosquitoes from reaching full hatch. You can see the larva in water, stagnant water, and you want to get rid of that. That will help. keeping the area dry. And then there's several fly traps. Even the wasps are fairly effective. The predator wasps, I think they're called, that will go after nothing but flies. They're as an option to keep your fly numbers down if at all possible. So you've done everything you could. You keep your pens clean, you check all the boxes for vaccination, and then you see this. And this is a sick bird. This is a very dramatically sick bird. The first telltale signs you're dealing with a sick animal might be more subtle. She might be laying less eggs, right? Instead of being pretty religious daily egg production, she goes to maybe 2, and then maybe 3, or 3 and then 2, or they aren't as active, listless, lethargic, certainly runny eyes and nose. Sickness does tend to show up in chickens in their eyes. That's a good telltale sign that you're dealing with something. They'll either kind of swell and close or run. So be careful of looking at the eyes. When you do pick them up, they're going to be warm to touch, and they will show labored breathing. So once you see an animal like this in your pen, do what you can to get him isolated from the other birds, because you don't know what you're dealing with. It could be just him or her. But to be safe, you want to get that animal away from the others. That's more protecting them, but then it also allows you to focus on treating the sick bird. If you really don't know what you're dealing with, consult a veterinarian. I will tell you that some vets aren't really well versed in chicken health and medicine, but they will know someone who is. So if anything, they can refer you to a veterinarian who's more versed in poultry, or the state veterinary office can also help. So when you have a sick bird, you want to treat it with an injectable, either the nape of the neck, under the wing. If you can do it under the skin, ideal. These are some drugs that are okay to give birds: Tylen, Baytril, Normycin, and Resfor. I would probably start with a Tylen or Baytril, but again, talk to your veterinarian. And then, just as a precaution, because birds tend to be fairly susceptible to sickness, go ahead and treat the rest of your flock with a medicated water, antibiotic, or in the feed for a few days, and monitor those birds very closely. It's better safe than sorry, in my mind, is to protect the rest of that flock, because again, you don't know exactly what you're dealing with. And by providing antibiotic, even though it's not going to help prevent viruses, it can help keep those birds a little bit more healthy, and give them a little bit of a boost to fight off any other insult that might come their way in terms of a virus infection. So if you're going to do this, you should be aware, if you're not already, that there is something called the Veterinary Feed Directive. Okay, so what is VFD? It's I should take new out because it's no longer new. 2015 has already been 7 years. That's crazy. But basically, starting in 2015, they were working on a program to the effect that any oral medications, meaning if it were to go in the water or in the feed or even a paste in the mouth, that it was going to require a veterinary prescription to purchase. So basically what this means is, at some point, if you have a sick animal and you're wanting to do sort of a mass treat with an antibiotic in the water to help protect the others, that will require veterinary consult and see that that is the best step for you. And if you both decide that, yes, this is probably a good thing to do, he or she will write a prescription, and you will contact the feed store that you normally buy feed from, and They will order that exact amount for you. So it might only be for chickens, like 150-pound bag of Noriamycin crumble is the smallest you can get, and that's all you will get. So once you run out of that product, you will need a new prescription if your problem persists. So I can tell you in terms of what next, our nice over-the-counter drugs, the penicillins, the LA200s, in very short order, these two are going to be taken off the shelf, and you will need a prescription for even those products, injectable antibiotics. So here's just some examples of the oral medications that are out there on the market that do now require a pet prescription. And I can tell you now, not all vets do this, but some veterinarians will charge for the writing of the prescription. I found that out the hard way. We had sickness starting to go through our bullpen, and I felt like it wasn't bad enough yet to do everybody come in the chute and get a shot. So I wanted to put it in the feed. And I ordered the feed, and then a month later, I get a bill for $100 for writing the script. So just be upfront with them, ask them, are you going to charge for the script? And hopefully they'll work with you because it's better to have a healthy bird or birds. And like I said, hopefully they don't try and price gouge you too much, if at all. So yeah, this actually took full effect in 2017. Okay, now let's move into avian flu briefly, since this is sort of the hot topic right now, because it can in fact affect you. It seems like people think, well, it's just in those big brood houses, the commercial hatcheries, the commercial egg producers. And no, in reality, because of how this virus works with the vectors, including wild birds, really any flock is at risk of experiencing avian flu. And this particular virus can be transmitted to humans as well. Okay, so the one that's currently in the US is highly pathogenic avian influenza, meaning it is extremely contagious. So they had to euthanize thousands of birds, turkeys, chickens, in the bigger poultry production states of like North and South Carolina and back east. So it's a very serious situation. Highly contagious, transmitted to humans, and lethal to most avian species, okay, including wild birds. So basically what happens is you'll see them gasping for air in a very dramatic fashion. It's going to be greater than panting. You'll see, actual heaving, like they can't get their breath. Severe diarrhea. Swelling around the head is hydrocephalus. Not a good prognosis after that. It usually results in fairly rapid death. So I tried to pull the most current map, and this was, I don't know the date that this was pulled, but when I pulled it this morning, and for whatever reason it wouldn't let me take a picture, it is now spread into Oregon. Oh, it's hit Oklahoma, Arkansas, Tennessee, Oregon, and Washington. Can't remember if Nevada's there, but it's just a matter of time before it finds New Mexico. Right now, though, we are clear of the disease, but that's where you can be proactive in protecting your own flock. So this is a picture of how avian can be spread to humans, but really this is a good description of how any disease can be spread to humans. And we're seeing more cases of salmonella and E. coli in people with birds because they like carrying them around as pets. And that's lovely. I had a chicken that would get on my lap and she'd let me pet her when I was a kid, and great. However, they are vectors for disease themselves. And so just be mindful of that be sure and handle your animals. If you don't have gloves, wash your hands a bunch after handling them. Wash your face. that kind of thing. Just make sure you're clear of any virus that might have gotten cross-contaminated from you touching the bird and then you touching your face in this picture, or you just, from an aerosol standpoint, breathe in some of those germs. So there's no vaccine for this disease. That's why it's become such a challenge. So they are recommending that you try and keep wild birds away by not drawing them in with feeders, including hummingbird feeders. So take down all your bird feeders. That will hopefully keep the wild bird population a little bit at bay. Ramp up your fly and mosquito control, because again, this is another vector that could transmit the disease. Do not at this time, and as soon as we kind of get over this wave, you can go back to buying outside birds, but I would not at this time buy outside birds until you know the threat is over. Chicks, buying chicks, probably at a little bit lower risk, but it's still a risk. So unfortunately, that's the safest way to kind of keep the disease at bay for your flock. But do keep an eye on your flock. Look for those telltale signs of respiratory distress, and then that net over the pen is a really good idea too, because you won't have, because even predators like birds of prey can carry this disease. So having the net over the pen, the manure, their bird poop can't fall into the pen and they can't come into the pen. So that's really important too. So all of that sort of leads into the biosecurity in general and keeping your flock safe. Always wash your hands after touching poultry, bedding, all of it. Just either wear gloves and a mask, or just be really religious at washing your hands after handling birds. Try not to handle the birds excessively. Don't kiss the birds. I don't know, people kiss their birds, but, and then salmonella has probably been the most prevalent issue with people catching salmonella from live birds. And that's why. It's just there's too much contact, and salmonella cannot be fully prevented. It's just an organism that's there, right? So do not expose your flock to wild waterfowl or poultry if possible. Buy chicks from a known source. Buy chicks from pullorum-free flocks. That's a disease that they guarantee that these chicks don't have. Keep young chicks away from older birds. That's mainly just survival. They can be cannibalistic, right? They'll kill another bird if it's weak or young. So just be mindful of that. And if you start to see dead birds, burn, bury, and do not, or compost the dead birds, right? Because again, you don't know what you're dealing with. Do not allow contaminated equipment to be brought into your premise. So meaning just common sense, right? If you used a shovel to pick up a dead bird, be sure and disinfect that shovel very well, because again, you don't know what you're dealing with. So this is a little strict, but keep visitors away from poultry houses. If you, like I said, been to those big barns, it's a shower in, shower out, got the full monkey suit on, just to kind of prevent diseases. And, but just be mindful of who's on your place and where have they been, just to keep your birds healthy. And then, dispose of sick chickens. Should disease appears, seek authoritative advice, meaning get a hold of this. If you suspect avian flu, you need to get the state veterinary office involved immediately. You can do that through your veterinarian or through your extension agent. Also consider using preventive medications, meaning vaccines. And be very mindful of the label recommendations before utilizing these treatments or vaccines. So, and even the manure treat as disease spreaders, right? Trying to keep your mice and rats at a minimum. They can contaminate the feed as well as just your area, and lice and other pests should be controlled just to keep them healthy. Keep the feathers on them and keep them healthy. Follow manufacturer's directions for vaccine. Keep different species of fowl segregated if possible. Again, that's more of a disease control thing than anything. And then don't sell birds that you know have been sick. So you want to have a reputable, if you raise birds to sell or to show, you want to have a good reputation. And so keep your birds healthy and sell good, healthy birds. Finally, this was I hated this job as a kid, and it was just awful. And I don't know any good way to describe cleaning a chicken coop, but it's not fun, right? So they've got fairly strong urea excrement, meaning their urine, and also the fecal matter. And so pretty powerful smells and the like. And because of the disease situation, really recommended, because it is hard on your respiratory as well, all the fumes, to wear a mask if you can, particularly if you have lung issues, just to keep yourself safe. And then treating the base with lye occasionally, that will kind of air out and dry the ground and kill off some of those bugs that need a wet place to live. When you do bring birds in, you can build this cute little handy, or have something that's a good 20 feet away from your other flock for at least 2 weeks. If you do bring in older birds like pullets, you want to make sure they're free from sickness, right? You can get them on your vaccination program if you decide to vaccinate, which I hope you do. And you can ensure that they're on your diet, they're eating well, their eyes are bright, and you're not throwing them to the dogs, so to speak, if you were to turn them in with the rest of the flock, where they would just really be hard on them. And so do have a plan to quarantine your animals, whether it be chickens or really anything, for a good 2 weeks prior to introduction to your home flock. So that's what I have, quick and painless, I hope. I know there's a lot more to raising chickens. Like I said, this is the 10,000 foot view. I should have included the links, and then maybe I'll look them up and include them in the chat. But I have a resource that goes in much more in depth in terms of building facilities, clear through your day-to-day management publication that I put together several years ago now. But then there's also a website that Bernalillo County put together that's a really nice kind of place to stop and find a bunch of different resources. And I'll bring those 2 links up for you, so you have that as a resource as well. What about adding recycled? Okay, so the question was adding recycled crushed up egg shells to feed. Is that a bad idea because of disease? No, not really. But one thing I would recommend is to heat them up, get them at, say like 350 degrees for a good, dry them out really well, right? You want them really brittle, so you can, and you won't degrade calcium because of heat. So you're not going to lose that calcium component of the eggshell. But I would recommend that you at least run them through the oven for 15 minutes at 350 degrees, just to kill off anything that might be there and to really get those eggshells nice and dry.
Okay, the link is there in the chat box. Another question is, when you go down to the feed store, as far as feed, when you get your chicks, you have your chick starter, and there's medicated and non-medicated. How long should you feed them medicated feed, and for how long, and then switch, what's the recommendation?
So medicated feed, if it's probably has what's called a coccidiosis or coccidiostat, that's the medication. It's probably not going to be at this point antibiotic. And what coccidiostats do is prevent scours, prevents the diarrhea, because all animals can suffer from that. So really that would be maybe the first couple of weeks that you have them. Just make sure they're not going to get into trouble with that. And coccidiosis is fairly contagious. Well, it's very contagious actually. So that's where keeping the brood pen or the brood little pen very clean, because you can have a bird with coccidiosis poop on the ground and then his buddy steps in it or for whatever reason pecks at it and then now he's sick, right? So it's really important in those first few weeks that you keep their living space very clean as you can, so to prevent some of that spread. But I would say no more than 2 weeks, and then you can shift them to something else. Now they're going to waste a lot of feed at first too, because they're not going to know what that is in that little tin, right? So they'll peck it, they'll scratch at it, they'll dump it, but just be prepared to do a lot of cleaning.
Right. Okay. And then there is a difference, you know, with the hen scratch and then also layer feed.
Yeah.
What do you recommend? I know they need, you know, X amount of hours to start to lay their eggs, and then winter comes on. You know, is that when they should apply layer feed?
So the difference between scratch and layer really is more nutrient density, meaning those layer rations are going to be really high in calcium. They're going to be really high in protein, and they're designed for egg production. They're also pretty expensive. Scratch is a nice energy supplement. It gives the birds something to do. It keeps them full, but it does provide energy for them. Those grains are very high in energy, but they're fairly low in protein, and they don't really carry a really substantial amount of they're actually kind of low in calcium as well. So you can run into trouble feeding only scratch, as you will if they're not eating enough, if you're not supplementing with oyster shell or something additional to eggs, whatever. You can run into some calcium issues just feeding scratch. So as far as winter time and them slowing down, that's more of just kind of them trying to maintain their own body weight because of the cold is why they typically tend to, and then daylight has some to do with it, not a bunch, but that's why they might slow down a little bit in the winter, just to reserve their own energy stores, because it does take a lot of energy to generate an egg every 24 hours. So to answer your question, if you're wanting to maintain production, then yeah, I would probably ramp up the layina or the laying feed in the winter for sure, if you're wanting to keep that production up.
Marcy, this is Marge. How are
Okay.
you doing? I have a question.
Sure.
I'm not a egg farmer, but I do have chickens for pets. I always wondered how long do they live? What's an old age on poultry?
So it kind of depends on their quality of life, right? If you're taking good care of them, 6 to 8 years. Just as a kid, we had a rooster that was probably pushing 7, and he got arthritic in his legs, and he was very mean. He'd chase you across didn't matter. He'd chase you, didn't matter. Well, when he got old, he got so arthritic, he'd just go boo and he'd fall over backwards, right? So yeah, probably that's 6 to 8 years of age, depending on the breed. Those bigger breeds aren't going to live as long. Bantams are fairly tough. I think they could live forever if they're fed right and don't have predators. It's probably breed dependent, but that would be my ballpark, would be about 6 to 8 years.
Just my observation on some other family, I noticed that they have a lot of chickens. And is there I'm thinking interbreeding. Is there an issue, or is there no issue on interbreeding? I don't know. I'm not really a chicken person, but I'm just kind of like, is there such thing as interbreeding for poultries?
Oh, for sure. And you'd be amazed that in your high production, they're as advanced in genetics as any other of the livestock industries. The AI chickens, right? Which is interesting. But so to answer your question, absolutely. There can be a point if there's not turnover in females, or roosters, I guess, would be more the direction, I guess, where I would go, is getting rid of a bunch of roosters and bringing in new ones. You can probably start to see it in reduced production. Maybe feather quality is not as good. You might even hit a recessive gene pop up and have deformities. So it's absolutely possible. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, okay. Thank you, Marge, for your question. And then one last question. I've noticed in the feed store, they do have those flock blocks. What does that consist of, and the benefits of that?
Flock blocks. I don't guess I know what that is, unless you're talking about if they're similar to like the quail blocks where they've got a little bit of mealworm in there and a little bit of corn, and that's good. Yes. What I like about those, that will reduce your pecking other birds. It will keep them busy, because if they're in a situation you're starting to see one get picked on more than the others and they're starting to lose feathers because they're getting picked on, this can help reduce some of that cannibalism. They're just keeping them busy. Because if they have opportunity, they're out pecking the ground all the time. So that's just a way to kind of entertain them, but also with the mealworms in there and maybe the sunflower seeds or what all else is in there, that can help kind of boost your protein a little bit in their diet.
Right. Okay. I know I said that was the last one, but one more. When you're buying your chicks, is there a way you can sex them? That way, you don't have to wait until they're older to find out which is a rooster and which is a hen.
I knew that question was going to come up, and I don't know.
Okay.
There is. There's a way to sex them. And I was going to add that in and I didn't get to it, but I can sure look it up. But you lift the tail, you should be able to tell.
Okay, great. Thank you, Marcy. I believe that concludes our Q&A session. And thank you again, Marcy, for setting time aside to provide this presentation. I know we got a lot of poultry farmers out here. And it's great to provide this information to them. A comment from Dan Bladel, really good information. Thank you very much. Okay.
So real quick,
we'll go
and
ahead
I don't know. Okay, well, just real quick, I forgot to add, and I know for you guys it may not be as big an issue, but if you're in an urban suburban area, you will want to check what the regulations are for having birds. Some don't allow for roosters. Some have minimums or maximums on number of birds you can have in a city limit. So just before you make that investment and set up a coop in your backyard, you'll want to check out what the city ordinances are, because you don't want to get in trouble. Anyway, that was just the other thing to add.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you, Marcy, and thank you, everyone, for your questions. I'd like to invite you guys to next week's webinar covering farm food safety provided by the COPE program food systems specialist. The Zoom link is on there. No registration is required, and it's on May 25th, Wednesday, 5:30 to 6:30. And then, and I welcome everyone to visit our website page, nsaproject.nmsu.edu. All of our information is up there. You know, if you want slides to this presentation and previous webinars, you can go on there and find it under, the webinar PowerPoint presentation section, and also upcoming webinars. And then also we have it on our Facebook page and then YouTube channel. And then if you guys need to get in touch with us, our email is up there, myself and Kelly. The Navajo Sustainable Agriculture Project is a New Mexico Cooperative Extension Service initiative delivered in collaboration with the Ned College Land Grant Office and COPE, the COPE program, which is Community Outreach and Patient Empowerment. The project is funded by USDA's Outreach and Assistance for Socially Disadvantaged Farmers and Ranchers and Veteran Farmers and Ranchers program. My name is Jessie Jim, and I am the field coordinator for the NSA project. And then we have our field specialist, who is Mikkel Lantana, and then also our project director, Dr. Michael Patrick. We do have 3 goals within our project. The first one is to improve the operations, the profitability and sustainability of socially disadvantaged Navajo farmers and ranchers and veteran farmers and ranchers. Secondly, we are increasing our Navajo farmers and ranchers' knowledge and use of USDA programs such as NRCS, FSA, Rural Development, Risk Management Agency programs, and services of those of other resource providers, And then lastly, we are increasing the local production and consumption of fresh fruits and vegetables and healthy food by Navajo families and individuals through our gardening program.